Are you confused by all the different video settings on your camera? In this video, I'm going to show you what all those settings mean and demonstrate how they work together so you can create higher quality, professional looking videos. Are you at the point where you're ready to break free from the confines of auto mode, but are confused and, dare I say, a little intimidated by all the different manual settings? Now, I'll admit when I started out, I was a little ignorant of terms like aperture, frame rate, shutter speed, white balance. Basically, I would just set it and forget it by putting everything in auto mode and assume everything would work out for the best. Not surprisingly, as time went on, I wasn't really happy with the results that I was getting, and that's when I started to learn how to manually set up my camera. When you're in auto mode, the camera is in complete control over all the exposure settings, doing its best to make the shot look as balanced as possible. And depending on what you're filming, this is not always a good thing. While auto mode can work as a great starting point, it will limit your artistic options and not always give you the optimal results that you're looking for. So before we get started, make sure your camera is set to manual mode. The first setting that we're going to look at is your video resolution. Resolution is the number of pixels displayed in the video frame. The higher the number, the sharper and crisper your video is going to look. For the highest quality video, I opt for 4K shooting. However, if you don't have this option, shooting in 1080p will work just fine. Another important setting to maximize your video quality is setting your picture profile. Now, if you're just starting out, selecting a standard profile that looks good straight out of the camera is the way to go. After selecting the profile, zero out all the settings, including sharpness, contrast, and saturation. Most cameras have built-in color profiles that will give the image a certain look. Now, on my Fuji, my preferred color profile is Classic Chrome, although I now shoot most of my videos in log. The reason for this is shooting in log will increase the camera's dynamic range, giving you a much higher quality result. I'll talk more about the benefits of shooting in log in another video. Let's talk about frame rate. What our eyes perceive as a moving image is actually just a series of pictures that move across the screen. The speed at which these images move across the screen per second is what we call the frame rate. For the most cinematic look, set your camera to 24 frames per second, or 24 FPS. And what this means is that 24 images are moving across the screen per second. 24 FPS is the industry standard for most Hollywood movies and the closest to how our eyes perceive reality. And that's what gives you that really immersive cinematic experience. Now, one common mistake that many beginners make, and certainly one that I did, is to shoot at 30 frames per second. And this is really just because that's the default setting for most cameras, which I really honestly don't understand. Now, this works fine for news and sports broadcasts because it gives us a sharper look, and they're also using a really high quality camera. But for people like you and me, it's just going to look like it was shot on a cheap camcorder. Now, when I'm shooting action shots where I want to slow the footage down, I will shoot at 60 frames per second and then reduce the frame rate down to 24 in post. All right, the key to capturing great shots is proper exposure. A properly exposed shot balances the highlights, midtones, and shadows. So when a shot is overexposed, it means that there's not enough light coming into the image, or it's just way too bright. If it's underexposed, it means there's not enough light coming in and it's too dark. The way to properly expose your shot is to balance the three settings that make up the exposure triangle, which are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed plays a critical role in making the image look more natural. If the shutter speed is too low, the result will be a lot of motion blur. If it's too high, then the image will start looking shaky and a little unnatural. A simple rule of thumb for setting the correct shutter speed is to set it to roughly twice that of your frame rate. For example, if you're shooting at 24 FPS, then you'll want to set the shutter speed to 1/48 of a second. 24 times 2 equals 48. Now, some cameras may not be that precise and will only allow you to go to 1/50th of a second, which is close enough. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you'll want to set the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. The next setting in the exposure triangle is the aperture. Aperture allows you to control how much light is passing through your camera's lens. And just like our eye pupils, can be adjusted to let more or less light into your frame. By rotating the aperture ring or selecting the aperture dial, depending on which kind of camera you have, you're effectively controlling exactly what amount of illumination will hit the camera sensor. Aperture is measured in what we call f-stops. A lower f-stop value means that more light is allowed into the lens, creating a shallow depth of field. Whereas a higher value means that less light is let in, but has a higher depth of field. I know it's a little confusing at first and it really threw me for a loop, but with time it will start to make more sense. The third setting of the exposure triangle is the ISO. ISO determines the light sensitivity of the camera's sensor and should only be adjusted after you've set the shutter speed and aperture. Now you want to keep your ISO setting as low as possible. If you set it too high, it's going to start making the image look a little too grainy. For example, if I'm shooting in log, my camera has a native ISO of 640, and I'll sometimes raise it up to 800 only if it's necessary. Whether you're filming out on location or indoors in a controlled environment, what we see isn't always what we get. And what I mean by this is that the human eye can be a little deceptive when determining the best exposure settings. The histogram is a graph that serves as a visual representation of the exposure values in terms of brightness levels. So if the image is overexposed, you'll notice that the data is bunched up on the right side of the graph. If it's underexposed, it'll be on the left side. Therefore, a properly exposed image should kind of resemble a mountain peak, where most of the data is in the center. Another tool that's really helpful for determining if the shot is properly exposed is the zebra setting. Just like the name implies, overexposed areas will have zebra stripes on them and will disappear after you've made the proper adjustments. Now, if you find that your image is still overexposed, even after making all the proper adjustments, one thing I would recommend is getting an ND filter. So think of an ND filter as a pair of sunglasses on your camera and will allow you to shoot in really bright conditions and still maintain a shallow depth of field. Let's talk about white balance. Setting the white balance will determine how realistic all your colors will look. This is especially important when filming people and getting the correct skin tones. When you set the white balance, you're adjusting the color temperature measured in kelvins. The goal is to make sure that the whites remain true and don't appear too cool or too warm. You can do it manually by adjusting the color temperature. For example, if you're filming outdoors, you'll want to set the color temperature to 5,000 to 6,000 Kelvin. And if you're filming indoors, you want to be around 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin. One thing you can also do is get a gray card and use that as a reference point, which will give you the most accurate results. Just remember to reset it for every scene. Setting up your camera properly can really be a game changer. Getting familiar with how these settings work will not only increase the quality of your footage, but is also going to save you tons of time in the editing process. Now, it may seem like a lot to remember, especially when you're out on a video shoot and there's a lot of moving parts. So what I would recommend doing is having a little cheat sheet that you can put on the back of your camera so you don't forget any of the important settings. Now, I promise you, after a bit of practice, eventually you'll get to the point where you don't even have to think about it anymore and you can put yourself in auto mode. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button and also hit the subscribe button if you want to learn more useful tips and tricks about shooting epic cinematic videos. My name is Andrew Cooper at A Cooper Video. I'll see you next time. Take care.